This lecture will focus briefly on residential environmental hazards. We're going to talk about just a few kinds of common residential hazards, the kinds of problems they cause, and how to control for these hazards. Much of what we've covered in this section has applied mainly to hazards in an occupational setting. For the last lecture of this section, we're going to discuss hazards that you encounter specifically in a residential setting. So we're going to discuss common harmful residential hazards that you have likely heard of, such as asbestos, carbon monoxide, lead, mold, and radon. There are many other residential environmental hazards. These are just kind of some of the top ones that you are more likely to encounter in your living space. First, we are going to discuss asbestos. So there are a number of naturally occurring fibrous silicate minerals that are more commonly referred to as asbestos. So asbestos isn't actually just one single mineral, it's a group of minerals that share some common characteristics that all fall under the name asbestos. Some of the most common types of these minerals are chrysotile, amosite, and chrysotillite. In the past, these minerals have been mined because they provide good thermal insulation, they have excellent chemical and thermal stability, and they possess high tensile strength. So they're really desirable for different manufacturing of residential products due to these different properties. So they in the past were used a lot in items that were needed to provide insulation, strength, and fire protection. The EPA actually attempted to ban the manufacturing of asbestos in the 80s and the 90s in the United States, but this ban was overturned, and therefore it is still legal to manufacture asbestos products. However, it is much less common in the United States to use asbestos in the manufacturing process. Some of the most common sources of asbestos in the home are vinyl flooring, duct wrapping around HVAC systems, insulation on hot water pipes and boilers, certain kinds of roof shingles and siding, attic insulation, as well as ceiling and wall insulation, and sheetrock taping compounds. However, as I mentioned in the previous slide, even though it is still legal to manufacture asbestos-containing products, it is now far less common for asbestos to be used in the manufacturing of these products compared to the pre-1970s era. So if you're living in a newer build home or apartment, this probably isn't really a concern for you, but if you are living in a house that was built in the 1970s or earlier, there is a good chance that there is some asbestos somewhere in your home. It's important to note that when asbestos is intact, then it's not considered harmful. So, for example, if you have some sort of insulation material or some sort of siding that is intact and it hasn't been damaged in any way and it contains asbestos in it, it's not considered to be harmful. However, it does become harmful once it is damaged or crushed. So say you had that piece of siding and you decided that you wanted to renovate your house and get rid of the siding. Once you start tearing apart that siding, asbestos fibers are released into the air, and at that point they can be inhaled and then accumulate in the lungs, and this can cause lung scarring or lung cancer. So this is why it's incredibly important to be aware of the materials in your household prior to starting any sort of renovations or demolition, because you don't want to disturb the materials or structures that contain asbestos without proper mitigation. Also, asbestos can only be identified under a microscope, so you will need to consult with an environmental hazard expert to be sure about its presence or absence. You can't just look at that siding without knowing anything about it and say this doesn't have asbestos in it. It may actually, and you need confirmation of that. In the same manner, if asbestos is present in your home, you will need to contact professionals to have it removed, and you should not attempt to remove it yourself. Another relatively common household hazard is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is an odorless, colorless, and tasteless gas that can be incredibly toxic to both humans and animals. Carbon monoxide, as you likely know, is a very serious residential hazard, in part because it is impossible to see, taste, or smell, which essentially makes it impossible to detect a leak unless you have a carbon monoxide detector. And so this is, I'm sure you've heard stories of families succumbing to carbon monoxide poisoning because they had no awareness that there was a leak in their house. It's not like if there's a fire and you can smell the smoke and you know to get out of the house. If you have a leak in your house of carbon monoxide, you won't know really until it's too late. Carbon monoxide is the result of incomplete combustion of carbon fuels, and it can be produced from both man-made and natural sources. So the most common sources of carbon monoxide in the home are those that utilize carbon fuels, such as unvented kerosene and gas space heaters, gas water heaters, furnaces or boilers, gas stoves and ovens, gas-powered equipment, and car exhaust. So if you operate any of these items in your home, which you most likely have at least one of these items in your home or apartment, it's very important that there is adequate ventilation and that they are properly maintained and operated. At lower doses, exposure to carbon monoxide causes flu-like symptoms, so things like headaches, dizziness, nausea, and fatigue. However, at higher concentrations, exposure to carbon monoxide causes all of those symptoms as well as impaired vision, confusion, reduced brain function, and eventually death. This is really due to the mechanism of action of carbon monoxide in the body. So carbon monoxide, once it enters the body, it combines with hemoglobin in the blood. It binds very tightly to hemoglobin, and this produces carboxyhemoglobin, which is, it causes inefficient oxygen delivery to organs and tissues. It can also bind to, carbon monoxide specifically, can also bind to other molecules such as myoglobin, and that can subsequently cause significant damage to the heart and the brain. So basically, your body is deprived of oxygen when carbon monoxide is binding to hemoglobin in your blood, and that is what causes all of these symptoms and eventually death. There are several important things that you can do to reduce your exposure to carbon monoxide in the home. So the first really is just very basic. You should make sure that any appliances that burn natural gas, kerosene, or any other fuels are properly installed and vented. You should then make sure that these appliances are maintained on a regular basis. So it's not enough to just make sure they're installed properly, but you need to keep up with their maintenance. Also, you should not use portable gas heaters in enclosed indoor settings. You should also not let your car idle for long periods inside the garage, particularly with the garage door shut. And most importantly, this is extremely important, it is imperative that you install carbon monoxide detectors throughout your home because this is the only way to truly detect a carbon monoxide leak in your home. Lead is a common environmental toxin that has been extensively used in the past in consumer products such as paint and gas. Like asbestos, it is not as commonly used in the United States in the manufacturing process. However, there are still a good bit of products that contain lead that are still in existence. So things that were manufactured in the past that contain lead are still around in a lot of areas. So many homes and apartments built before 1978 may have paint that contains lead, which is one of the most common sources of exposure in the home. It can also be found in things like ceramics, stained glass, and fishing weights. So just some sort of common household items that are older, it may be present in those. Young children are particularly at risk for exposure as they tend to put objects in their mouths, which is the primary route of exposure to lead in consumer products. So unlike asbestos, which gets into the air and is inhaled, lead exposure comes from ingesting lead, which is why it is a big concern in the pediatric population. So for this reason, pediatricians should ask about the age of the residence that the child lives in to evaluate their risk of exposure to lead-based paint, and they should also take a blood sample to measure lead levels in the blood of children who may be at risk. Lead exposure can cause irreversible brain damage, convulsions, and death, particularly in children who are exposed. If lead poisoning goes undetected in these children, it can also cause behavioral problems, reduced intelligence, anemia, and liver and kidney damage. If adults are exposed, so say they weren't exposed as children, but then they become exposed as adults, it can cause reproductive problems, high blood pressure, kidney disease, digestive problems, nerve disorders, memory problems, and muscle and joint pain. So really, lead can cause a whole host of really bad symptoms in both children and adults who are exposed. The best way to reduce lead exposure in your home is to keep your home as clean and free of dust and paint chips as possible. So you should also wash your children's hands often, keep their play spaces clean, wash their bottles, toys, pacifiers, stuffed animals, anything that goes in their mouth. Those things should be washed regularly. It's also advised to take a supplement daily of iron and calcium to help lower the absorption of lead. You can also repair damaged painted surfaces, and then if you have soil that has high lead levels, you can plant grass or use landscaping materials to cover that soil. These two things, repairing the damaged painted surfaces and planting grass over the soil, are really just temporary fixes. So these things can help mitigate the problem, but really what you need to do if you have lead in your home or in your soil is hire experts to help remedy lead problems in your home or in your soil. The next very common household hazard we will discuss is mold. Molds are simple, microscopic organisms, and they are virtually everywhere. They're very important for our ecosystems, but they can be harmful to human health if found in high levels inside the home. It's important to point out that everyone is exposed to some mold on a daily basis without concern, so it's not harming you. However, if there are large numbers of mold spores present in the home, they can cause health problems. As you likely know, mold is often found due to flooding, leaky roofs, plumbing leaks, overflow from sinks, showers, and tubs, damp basements or crawl spaces, and steam from bathing, laundry, and cooking. So really, moisture is a huge factor in the development of mold inside your home. Exposures to high levels of mold, because like I said, if you're exposed to very low levels of mold on a regular basis, and that's fine. But if you're exposed to high levels of mold, it can cause health problems through inflammation, allergic response, or sometimes infection. Typical symptoms of mold exposure are breathing problems, nose or sinus congestion, eye irritation, dry hacking cough, and skin rashes. And occasionally, mold can trigger asthma attacks in people who suffer from asthma. To control for mold, there are really a lot of steps that you need to take to get rid of the mold and stop it from spreading in your house. So first, you need to identify the area of mold, figure out where the mold is, as well as the reason for the mold. Where is the source of moisture coming from? Once you've identified these things, you then need to stop the source of moisture, remove excess water, move wet items to a dry, well-ventilated area, and then also cut out walls or flooring that can't be moved. So if you have, furniture that is in the moldy area, you can simply move that to another place and take care of it. But if the mold has gotten into your drywall, you will need to cut out your drywall to access it from behind. You will then need to increase air circulation and run fans and dehumidifiers. Again, the whole goal is to dry out the moisture. So after everything is dried out, it is then possible to clean the mold using specific cleaning materials. However, as with most household hazards, it is often advised to hire a professional to take care of this issue if possible. Another common household hazard that we've actually already discussed in this course is radon. As we've learned previously, radon is a colorless, tasteless, odorless, radioactive gas that comes from the decay of uranium found in nearly all soils. It can enter buildings such as homes and apartments via cracks and openings in concrete slabs, crawl spaces, floor drains, and hollow wall concrete blocks. So this little infographic here from the CDC, which we had in one of our previous lectures, shows multiple ways that radon can get into your house from the soil. Long-term exposure to elevated levels of radon can increase your risk of lung cancer. However, it's very important to note that exposure does not cause any immediate symptoms such as acute respiratory effects. So really, it's important to have your home tested for radon so that you can assess for your long-term risk. You may not know that you are being exposed to radon over the years, and the problems that you will develop from radon exposure won't come around for another 30 years or so, for example. So it's not like a lot of these other household hazards where the health effects are more immediately apparent, and so you know that there's a problem and you can mitigate it. So that's why it's important to have your home tested for radon. I included this map that shows the risk of radon across different regions of the United States. And so fortunately here in the South, we have kind of a low potential for radon to be present. And you can see other areas of the country have much higher predicted average indoor radon screening levels. And they have much higher potential for radon exposure in their homes from the soil. To best control for radon exposure, you should ensure that any cracks and entry points from the ground are sealed, and also that your home is well ventilated so that if radon does enter your home, it does not become trapped inside your home. And again, you can hire professionals to test for radon and help with the mitigation process. This little infographic here shows the recommended radon detector placement within the home. As you can kind of tell from their suggestions, it's best to measure radon levels kind of close to the ground or the windows or outside walls, so that because these are places where radon is more likely to be entering the home. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the lecture, this is not an exhaustive list by any means of residential environmental hazards. However, as you may be able to tell, there are kind of two common themes with all residential environmental hazards, and that is the proper installation, maintenance, and use of items in the home that can cause hazards, as well as the use of professionals to both evaluate the hazards and mitigate the hazards.